It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you, and I'm grateful for your interest in this evening's lecture, which is very special for me and for the Institute. Dr. Christie is visiting Boston, Boston College, and very graciously accepted to be with us for a lecture this evening. I think most of you probably know him, so you know how it goes, you don't need to introduce someone, but I mean, it's all there anyway, and you will know his books, I'm sure, from those of you that have any interest in the desert tradition or the contemplative tradition. I am happy to be welcoming and introducing you, Doug, as a very close friend and fellow sojourner, someone that I admire very much, not just for his knowledge, not just for his interest in things that I'm interested in, not just because he loves the Desert Fathers or loves the environment or contemplation, but something that for many years now I've admired in people, and that is the ability to grow. Because as scholars we tend to reach certain levels and then don't continue growing. It happens to us as clergy as well, where we get to a point where we're giving and not receiving, no longer learning, developing. And I'm always impressed when people can make that next step, even outside of their comfort zone, to deal with even areas that they've always been interested in, but opening up new windows, discerning new frontiers. I remember experiencing that, since we're an ecumenical institute, with a well-known theologian and monastic from Mount Athos, now older in age, but nonetheless still very influential in Greece and in the Orthodox world generally, the former abbot of Stavronikita Monastery on Mount Athos, Father Vasilios, later moved to Iviron. I remember approaching him once because his book was one of those books that I would always say to myself, if you're ever stuck on an island, what book would you take? And let's leave sort of the New Testament or the Bible out of the conversation. Apart from that, what would you take? I think it would be his hymn of entry for me. It's kind of like Schmemann's For the Life of the World. It's these sort of life-transforming books and times of reading as you're studying theology. And I remember asking him years after he published the book, that's in print, of course, by St. Vladimir's in their series of modern Greek theologians, that I said to him, I love your book so much, but why are you so negative toward the Roman Catholic tradition or the non-Orthodox tradition? To which he very, very naturally responded, that was then. That was at that particular point in time in the history of the Greek Orthodox Church or the Ecumenical Patriarchate or Mount Athos or my life. That was then, and he proceeded to tell me where he was now. And I do admire that. And with Doug, I've seen a similar growth. I don't mean that in a patronizing way. I mean that in a way that I connect and admire that in our friendship, where he begins with the word in the desert and the quest for holiness, the importance of Scripture in the Desert Fathers that we all love. And from there he moves to the blue sapphire of the mind, which touches on ecology and his love for creation and the environment. And then more recently, the insurmountable darkness of love, where he tries to bridge mysticism and contemplation with the common life, with community, with the world. And he does that in his writing, as I say, but also in his teaching, and he does that in his relationship. That I've always admired in Doug, and I'm grateful to have you here this evening to speak.
I think I can say in this gathering, use this word, it's a deep blessing to have a friend such as John Christopherus. I'm so grateful to know you and to have known you all these years, and really it happens sometimes when you become friends with someone and the years go by and time and geography keep you somewhat distant. There's something miraculous, and I think communities of faith know this. You carry the presence of that person within you. It's a spiritual companionship, and I feel like we've been walking together for a long time now, and I cherish that friendship that we have. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I think I want to say just a very brief word about how much it's meant to me in my life to be able to sojourn among the Orthodox seekers that have meant so much to me. It's hard to explain sometimes, or to yourself or to anyone else, how something could have happened, how you could have been drawn down a certain path, how an unwashed wild youth from California could have found himself unable to stay away from the ancient Christian monastic tradition, both in terms of its literature, but also in terms of the lived communities that I ended up spending time with on Mount Athos and in Egypt and elsewhere, communities who spoke to me about my own deepest longings, and the witness of those communities and that tradition have never left me. So I stand here tonight as someone who's been kind of living within this world for a long time, learning from it, being blessed by it, struggling with it at times. So I'm grateful to be here. The title of the talk is Night in the Desert, an Ancient Monastic Ecology of Darkness. I'll begin with two images of darkness. The first, I'm making my way slowly along a sandy wash at the bottom of Barrier Canyon in southern Utah, hoping to get back to my campsite before dark. Ahead of me, I catch a sight of something moving, a faint motion against the canyon wall. What is it? Insects? No, too big. Canyon wrens? It's a little late in the day for them. I pause to let my eyes adjust to the fading light, and then I see them, a cluster of tiny bats circling above a pool of water that has formed in the slick rock. I stand for a long time watching them, touching gently into the pool and circling up and out into the night again and again. The last light slowly bleeds from the sky, then they are gone. The second image. I'm standing outside the gates of St. Anthony's Monastery on the Galala Plateau near the Red Sea in Egypt. The roaring generator that supplies power to the monastery has suddenly switched off, and the monastery is plunged into darkness. It is quiet, still. I can feel my breathing deepen. I scan the horizon. The outline of the mountains behind me is beginning to take shape. So too the walls of the monastery, but everything else is lost in blackness, except up against the mountains, a tiny pinprick of light. What can it be? Then I realized someone dwelling inside the mountain, maybe a half a mile or so from the monastery, has just lighted a lamp. The mountain is glowing from within. These experiences surfaced unexpectedly in my memory recently as I began to think about how the night functioned in the lives of the early Christian monks, how they experienced the night, what it meant to them, and how much we can grasp of the reality of the night in early Christian monastic experience, not only as a symbol of spiritual experience, which is often the most prominent reference to darkness, but also as part of the rhythm and texture of early monastic life. These questions in turn brought me back to my own recent experiences of finding myself immersed in darkness, the sense of moving through the dark, being in the dark, feeling its mysterious presence and power, and the recognition of how increasingly rare this is, how seldom I am ever moving through a space of darkness without some light source illuminating it. Yes, it is becoming increasingly rarer in our experience. We are losing darkness in our world as part of the phenomenon known as light pollution spreads and deepens. Nor is this merely an aesthetic loss, the loss of the distinctive beauty of the night. It is eroding the world itself, as living beings sensitive to both light and darkness find themselves without access to the very thing that makes life possible for them, a space devoid of light. That evening in Barrier Canyon remains precious to me in no small part because of its singularity and relative rarity, a moment in my own experience when everything else fell away and there was only that darkness and those canyon walls and the presence of those tiny bats at home in the night, circling and circling nearby. So too with that moment in the Red Sea desert, although it was more complex and challenging. The inner mountain, as it has been known since the 4th century when St. Anthony made it home, is still sacred, especially to Coptic Christians, and access to its deep solitude is still possible. But that solitude is regularly pierced by tour buses, digital devices of various kinds, the sounds of construction, and yes, the roar of generators, except at night, when the darkness and silence return, and when a contemporary traveler or pilgrim can still imagine, if only for a moment, what it might have felt like in another time to be enveloped by the desert at night. And perhaps, just for that moment, what it feels like now. What it feels like now, however, carries with it the sad recognition that darkness itself is increasingly disappearing from our world, and that the ecological crisis we are facing includes and is shaped by this profound loss. This, then, is the larger context in which these reflections on ancient Christian monastic experience of and ideas about the night, what I will call for shorthand their sense of the night, are situated. The retrieval of the ancient monastic sense of the night can help us here, I think, by expanding and deepening our understanding of what the Swedish bat scientist Johan Eklof has described as night as an ecological niche. To speak this way about the early Christian monastic world requires some translation, of course, for ecology in the way that we have come to understand the term did not exist for the early Christian monks. Even so, there is, I think, a kind of ecology of experience to be discovered there, in which night and darkness play a central part. To uncover this ancient monastic ecology of the night requires an approach that attends carefully to both the practical material elements of everyday life and the imaginative spiritual process of meaning-making that unfolded in a special way at night. The material turn in scholarship on early Christian monasticism in recent years has underscored the importance of attending carefully to the social, economic, cultural dimensions of monastic life and practice, and the difficulties that can arise when that world is seen only or primarily through the lens of spiritual ideas. In a similar vein, something that is increasingly referred to as the archaeology of the night is gaining growing importance among scholars seeking to better understand the critical but often hidden elements of past human experience that took place after the setting of the sun. Here, attention is focused on those particular activities and concerns that surface during the nighttime hours and that are often neglected when we attend only or primarily to what appears in the light of day. This includes specific kinds of nocturnal work, security concerns that became heightened at night, ritual practice and gatherings that are suited to the dark and places of rest, sexual trysts, and dreams. Early Christian monks had their own distinctive nighttime practices, keeping vigil being perhaps the most widely recognized of these. But this hardly begins to encompass what it meant for them to inhabit the night. Stories from early monastic literature also provide evidence for what it meant for monks to travel and work and eat during nighttime hours, to sleep and dream and fantasize, and to struggle, think, talk, and pray from dusk until dawn. The attention they gave to reflecting upon the particular gifts, demands, and challenges of the night suggests that they were sensitive to its power and importance in their lives. To consider the distinctive ecology of the night within early Christian monasticism can, I think, help us rethink the place of darkness in our own lives and ask what it will mean for us to honor and cherish the night. To begin, consider the image of the monk Longinus, quote, sleeping in the open air at night. Early monastic literature, as well as archaeological evidence, gives us a consistent picture of monks inhabiting cells or caves or little clusters of dwellings that came to be known as lavras. Also, at least in the case of those who followed Pachomius, Shenouda, and others in larger, more elaborate monastic settlements. But the image of a monk sleeping in the open air at night is unusual. Was such a practice common? And why would a monk undertake such a practice? The story told of Abba Longinus suggests that his practice of sleeping in the open air at night was hardly an exercise in simple rustic living. It was rather rooted in his long-standing and complicated impulse to go off into the desert. That is, to live what he believed to be a more extreme and pure expression of monastic life. This impulse is characterized in the story as arising from the presence of certain logismoi, or thoughts that are agitating him to live with greater ascetic rigor, something that invites the reader to anticipate the likely unhappy outcome. Longinus follows this impulse to leave his cell for the desert, and for 3 days he wanders outside, keeping an ever stricter diet, even stricter than the one he was accustomed to, and sleeping in the open air. In the end, he becomes exhausted and realizes he cannot live in the desert in this way. He also realizes the problematic character of the thoughts that were moving in him and motivating him to do so, and he returns to his cell chastened. If you cannot perform the deeds of the desert, he says to himself, remain in your cell with patience, weep for your sins, and do not go astray. Ultimately, this is less a story about nighttime living than it is about the dangers of a certain kind of pride. Still, the night plays an important role here as the locus, along with the desert, where the monk's struggles with pride are worked out. And perhaps it is not only this. Was it only his struggle with his idea of himself, a monk who could easily navigate the rigors of the night in the desert, that exhausted and ultimately defeated him? Or was it also the loss of security and the feeling of exposure that came with sleeping out in the open air at night? That Longinus finds himself unable to inhabit the night or the desert with such naked abandon is finally less important to the story than his recognition of the compromised impulses that led him to undertake this practice in the first place, and his discovery that he can now inhabit his cell with humility and openness. The night here is experienced as a locus of intense struggle, not as alluring or welcoming as the monk first imagined it to be. Ultimately, it helps him return to himself. A very different image of the night is presented in a story about Abba Theonis, found in the Historia Monachorum. We are told that the monk ate vegetables, but only those that did not need to be cooked. They say that he used to go out of his cell at night and keep company with the wild animals, giving them to drink from the water which he had. Certainly one could see the tracks of antelope and wild asses and gazelles and other animals near his hermitage. These creatures delighted him always, end quote. The story, to a much greater extent than the one told of Abba Longinus, presents us with an idealized, even mythologized image of the monk. Abba Theonis is portrayed as inhabiting a kind of paradise in the company of wild animals, a new Eden. This is hagiography, not history, and makes no pretense to be anything else. Still, it reveals something important about how the early monastic tradition envisioned the world unfolding after the sun went down, or how it could be. Here, the desert at night is not a fearful, forbidding place, as the story of Abba Longinus depicted it to be, but an Irenic place full of possibility. Abba Theonis is revealed to be someone not at war with himself, struggling with pride or anger or any of the other passions so carefully documented in early monastic experience, but someone at home with himself, a person for whom the desert feels like home, and a person for whom the practice of leaving his cell at night to commune with the animals nearby was completely natural. As with many other such stories depicting monks and animals in the early monastic tradition, we are invited to imagine Abba Theonis' nocturnal wanderings as revealing a monk who has crossed an important threshold into a space of intimacy and freedom with God, but also with all other living beings. This reflects a larger conversation among early Christians about how or whether it was possible to inhabit heaven or paradise here and now, or as the monastic literature often described it in clear allusion to the Gospels, what it might mean to live free from care. Stories of nocturnal travel are not uncommon in early monastic literature. Often they provide glimpses into how precarious and difficult it could be to move through the desert at night. Still, they are not mere travelogues, but often contain teaching that the reader is invited to consider as part of a larger set of concerns relating to monastic life and thought. A story from the Historia Lausiaca, for example, describes Macarius of Alexandria wandering the desert at night, uncertain of exactly where he was going or how he would find his way back. He wished to visit the garden tomb of Janus and Jambres, but since the holy man did not know the road, the text says, he followed the stars, traversing the desert as though it were the sea. There's something poetic in this image of a monk moving through the desert at night, guided by the stars. We know from other ancient sources that travelers often made their way through the vast desert in just this way. But did the monks really know how to read the night sky? Did Macarius? We don't really know. And in any case, the story's principal interests are focused elsewhere. Still, it is interesting to note that as a counterpoint to the sense of confidence and freedom expressed above, Macarius undertook the precaution of bringing with him bundles of reeds and placing one every mile or so to help him find his way back. After 9 days, he reached his destination, only to discover that a demon had collected all the reeds he had carefully placed along the way and placed the entire bundle by his head while he slept at the garden tomb. The text says, God had permitted this for his own further training. I think we're allowed to smile at some of these statements. Stranded in the desert at night, no idea how to get home, and it was permitted for your further training. So this is what we're told, so that he might not place his trust in reeds, but rather in the pillar of the cloud that led Israel for 40 days in the desert. The message is clear. Here was an opportunity for the monk to learn to trust not in himself, but in God alone. That Macarius failed to do so, at least initially, created the conditions for him to learn to practice a deeper trust. And he did so upon his return journey, which lasted not 9 days, but 20, and nearly led him to die of exposure in the desert. He eventually ran out of water and bread and was, we are told, in a very precarious position. But when he was on the verge of collapse, he saw a herd of antelope with a mother suckling its calf. Macarius crawled under her, sucked and was refreshed, says the text, and the antelope accompanied him back to his cell and nursed him. This story has a charming and even a little bit fantastical quality and is clearly focused on the perennial concern among early desert monks regarding what it meant to live free from care. Still, the complex depiction of the night in the desert in the story reveals something important about the way these spaces were imagined by the monks and how they functioned within their spiritual learning. The night and the desert are simultaneously alluring and threatening. The night sky, if one knows how to read the stars, can guide a monk across the open, trackless expanse of the desert, or so we are given to believe. Still, it is easy to get lost, and so markers are placed along the way. Any prudent traveler would do the same. That a mischievous demon appears and wreaks havoc on the monk's careful planning moves the story into a very different register, turning the focus toward questions about the deeper sources of the monk's faith and trust in God. These questions surface in a slightly different way in a story found in the Historia Monachorum about a monk living in the further or more remote desert. The monk in question found the relentless assaults from the demons in that remote place too much to bear and realized he could no longer remain there. We are told that, getting up, he set off for the inhabited region, traveling by night through the desert. The story is focused on the monk's struggle with pride in the withering solitude of the further desert and his gradual recognition that he needed the relative security and community to be found in the Nile Valley. He thought he could survive in solitude on his own, but he couldn't. And so he abandoned the place and traveled back toward the relative security of the Nile Valley at night. This is noted in passing in a way that suggests that it was not necessarily uncommon for monks living in the further desert to sometimes find themselves compelled to leave such remote places for gentler and less threatening ones. It also signals something about the geographic range of early monastic movement and the relative frequency of travel between the further desert and the Nile Valley, as well as the Thebaid in the south and Scetis in the north. How much of this monastic travel took place at night and how many challenges it presented is difficult to say. In this case, it seems to have come off without incident. And while this nighttime journey did not present the kind of fraught spiritual challenges that plagued Macarius in the story cited above, there is a kind of shadow that hangs over this story, the terror of the further desert, something that would have included, of course, many long solitary nights. These images of solitary nighttime living often focused on the experience of monks living in or moving alone through the vast expanse of the open desert reflect one important dimension of early Christian monks' experience of the night. Also important, as I will discuss shortly, was their experience in explicitly monastic spaces. But there's also evidence to suggest that monks frequently spent time at night outside the confines of the monastery, interacting with their neighbors within a complex and often challenging social world. We hear, for example, of a monk who acknowledges that he used to go off at night to a place of sinning, a barely coded reference to his habit of spending time in brothels, something that surfaces with surprising frequency in early monastic literature. The cover of darkness was essential to such encounters. A very different story describes Abba Serapion praying all night with a prostitute, a simple and beautiful act of accompaniment with a woman who had no doubt been forced by circumstances into this life. We also hear of Abba Poemen sending a brother at night to deliver wine to a man whose wife was giving birth, and delivering food to some laborers who were working at some distance from the place where he was living, after which he was compelled by circumstances to spend the night out on the open road. A story told of Moses the Ethiopian from the time before he became a monk relates how one night he swam across the Nile with a saber between his teeth and stole 4 rams from a local shepherd, which he then proceeded to slaughter and eat, washing it down with copious amounts of wine. I know we're meant to be drawn to the monks' lives after they converted, but sometimes you wonder what it would have been like to meet them before. And we hear of Abba Paphnutius, again before he became a monk, intervening one night to prevent a woman from being raped by a band of thieves. These stories reveal something interesting and unexpected about the experience of night among the early Christian monks. It was not limited to time spent in solitude in the further desert, or traveling at night from one place to another, or to nighttime activities in the monastery or lavra. Instead, we see monks interacting with their neighbors in the world in shared nocturnal activity. Still, what about the night in the monastery or cell, those distinctively monastic spaces where monks worked out their vocations in a particular way? What was it like to enter and inhabit the night in these spaces? The practice of vigil or prayer in the night occupied a central importance in early monastic thought and practice. The monks' reflections on this practice include simple accounts of the practice itself and why it was deemed to be so important. But we also encounter stories of how immensely challenging this practice could be, monks sometimes going almost completely without sleep, and others simply unable to stay awake. There's also evidence to suggest that reading and teaching and conversation often took place deep into the night. Cassian is especially eloquent on this. And that demons used the cover of darkness to launch their most ferocious attacks against the monks. But the nighttime hours also ushered the monks into the most profound moments of spiritual experience. Reflections on the importance of watchfulness or vigilance in the night recur throughout early monastic literature, both in the experience of solitaries as well as that of cenobites. One of the simplest and most eloquent statements of this practice comes from Abba Daniel, who relates simply that Abba Arsenius would spend the whole night watching. This was apparently not uncommon. Or Abba Apollo, for example, of whom it was said that he occupied a small cave and dwelt there at the foot of the mountain. His work consisted of bending his knees 100 times in the night and as many times again in the day. And a monk named John, we are told, began by standing under a rock for 3 years in uninterrupted prayer, not sitting at all or lying down to sleep, but simply snatching some sleep while standing. It is not always easy to know how to judge the accuracy of these stories. Clearly, they were told and passed on in part to impress upon readers the serious devotion required of those who wish to undertake the monastic life. But the consistent presence of such stories in early monastic literature leaves little doubt about the importance of this particular dimension of monastic life, the long and often difficult struggle to remain watchful in the night. In cenobitic life, this practice seems to have been somewhat more structured than it was for solitaries. The life of Pachomius, for example, states that the rule of monastic life, according to what we have learned from those who went before us, is as follows. We always spend half the night, and often even from evening to morning, in vigils and the recitation of the Word of God, also doing manual work with threads, hairs, and palm fibers, lest we be overcome by sleep. The language here suggests a subtle and varied practice, vigils, whose precise character is not clearly defined, and recitation of Scripture, along with manual labor, one of whose primary purposes seems to have been the staving off of sleep. The question of sleep emerges in various guises throughout the literature and was clearly a source of anxiety for early Christian monks. We learn, for example, of the presence of wakers, whose sole task was to rouse those who might otherwise miss the night vigils, or to wake them if they fell asleep. You can imagine how popular they were. And we hear of monks so desperate to fend off sleep that they would put bags of sand on their shoulders and shuffle back and forth in the night outside their cells. Fatigue seems to have been an accepted part of what it meant to keep vigil. The tiredness from keeping vigil is a delight to us, said Abba Moses. The unfinished toil, the nakedness, the complete deprivation, the fear that goes with this enormous loneliness do not frighten us off. There's a certain bravado here, I think, that belies the real difficulty of such practice and the modesty that surfaced in other teaching about vigils. It is not uncommon, for example, to find monks counseling a more moderate sleeping practice in recognition, it seems, of the particular dangers extreme sleep deprivation could bring. Still, Abba Moses' statement is sobering and suggestive of the complexity of monastic thinking about the practice of keeping vigil in the night. Should we read this statement as an expression of someone who was utterly impervious to the kind of doubt or uncertainty that so often arose in the night? Or does it express something more complicated, an acceptance, perhaps, of the particular kind of loneliness and struggle that night can bring, and a sense of the importance of facing this reality? It's not easy to say. The night could be a time of extreme psychological vulnerability, when the attacks of demons increased in intensity and the inner resources for responding to those attacks could feel scarce. To cite just one well-known example from the life of Anthony, we hear how the enemy, approaching one night with a multitude of demons, whipped him with such force that he lay on the earth, speechless from the tortures. The sense of helplessness and fragility here is palpable, even if the particular character of the monk's suffering remains unknown. Still, there are hints in the literature that such experience sometimes brought monks close to despair. For 12 years after I had gone 50, one elder recounts, the enemy did not interrupt his attacks on me by day or by night. I came to the conclusion that I was being tyrannized because God had abandoned me. There's something haunting, I think, in this admission of utter spiritual abandonment, and it serves as an important reminder of the presence of something close to despair in early Christian monastic experience. Still, even when God felt close at hand, the power of certain encounters could leave one almost completely undone. I nearly had my soul torn out of me last night, says Pachomius, recalling one particularly harrowing experience of prayer. Here we draw close, I think, to the subjective experience of the night in the lives of the monks. Sometimes they felt utterly lost, undone, other times touched by something ineffable. Not everyone survived such experience, and yet it was also just such moments of intense vulnerability that created the conditions for the expression of solidarity with and accompaniment of others in the night. Our life and death is with our neighbor, said Abba Anthony. The call to practice simple, compassionate regard for one's neighbor, especially those beset by suffering, was at the heart of the early Christian monastic experience. And sometimes the opportunity and invitation to practice such regard emerged with particular force in the night. A story is told of Pachomius who, hearing of a brother who is grievously suffering, instructs one of his brothers, "When night falls, bring him to me." Elsewhere, Athanasius relates a story about a time when Anthony came upon a brother who was so tormented by demons that he devoured his own excrement. Anthony, says Athanasius, offered prayers and stayed up with him the whole night. One can well imagine the scene, a monk experiencing what might be described as complete mental, spiritual collapse, utterly lost to himself, and beyond help, at least in this moment, of any kind of spiritual counsel. Instead, amidst terrors of the night too deep to name, there is a simple gesture of accompaniment, a refusal to leave the suffering brother alone, and a steadfast beseeching on his behalf. Still, the struggles in the night were not always so extreme. Another story, one of my personal favorites, tells of some brothers who once approached Abba Poemen, complaining about certain monks who were unable to remain watchful in the night. In a plea for more rigor, and in what surely expressed not a little resentment regarding the unfairness of the situation, they asked the elder whether he could rouse the sleeping brothers so that they would remain awake for the night prayers. But Poemen demurred, saying, "For my part, when I see a brother who is dozing, I put his head on my knee and let him rest." This story offers an important counterpoint to the recurring emphasis in the early monastic literature on the importance of remaining vigilant in the night. It was important and occupied a necessary part in monastic discipline, but other things like simple kindness and tenderness were more important. Weariness in the face of the long night must have been a common experience among early monks. So too the sense of shame, self-doubt, and discouragement that would have surely arisen within at least some of those who found it difficult to remain awake. Poemen no doubt understood all of this. His practice of showing simple kindness toward those who were unable to stay awake not only speaks clearly to what he himself valued most, but also places the practice of vigilance in the night in proper perspective. It was a practice oriented toward deepening self-knowledge in prayer and compassion. And it invited, as every aspect of monastic life did, careful and open-hearted attention to one's neighbor. This serves as an important reminder of how often the nocturnal struggles of monks took place within the context of wider shared experience, and how often the only way out of the deep impasse of the night was to look beyond your own narrow concerns and tend to the need of others. A story told of Abba Moses, the Ethiopian, once a notorious robber, reveals both the extent and limits of solitary nighttime practice, also the unexpected help to be found in moving out of solitude toward others. The demons, we are told, attacked him in order to draw him back toward his old ways of intemperance and impurity, and he was tempted to such an extent that he nearly failed in his resolution. He redoubled his ascetic efforts, but continued to be consumed by fire and troubled by dreams. This was because he had not withdrawn his mind from certain images from his previous life. An elder counseled him to give yourself over to vigils, pray and fast, and soon you will be rid of them. So he returned to his cell and pledged that throughout the night he would not lie down or even bend his knee. He stayed in his cell 6 years, standing in the middle of his cell every night praying, never shutting his eyes. Still, he could not control his mind. Here's an extreme, but not uncommon expression of something early Christian monks struggled with all the time, the difficulty of facing and responding to the churning of logismoi, or thoughts, and finding at least some degree of peace. The life of prayer, especially the long nighttime hours of keeping vigil, was in many ways defined by this very struggle. And while we do hear of certain monks having reached a state of what Evagrius refers to as apatheia, or impassibility in prayer, or what Cashin calls fiery prayer, for many monks the struggle with thoughts in darkness was unrelenting. So it seems to have been for Abba Moses. He could not find a way out of this crisis. Eventually, we are told, he started another way of life. Each night he went out to the cells of the old men, and he took their water pitchers and kept them filled without their knowledge. Even this practice, although it brought him closer to the relief he was seeking, did not free him completely of the attacks of the demons. But the impulse to abandon the ascetic rigors of solitary nocturnal struggle and tend to the needs of his brothers is telling. There was only so far he could go in contending with his own thoughts in solitude. He had, as the text says, he had to start another way of life. And so he did, setting off in the night to draw water from a distant well and carry it in secret to his brothers, a practical gesture of generosity toward others that brought healing to him. So, to conclude, such hidden work captures something important about early monastic experience, the sense of what it meant to pay attention and become responsive to the subtle movements of spirit in oneself and others in the silent emptiness of the night. It is this, I think, that enables us to at least begin speaking of an ancient monastic ecology of darkness. If by this we mean to include not only the nocturnal worlds of stars, animals, and social interactions taking place under the cover of darkness, but also the hidden movement and struggle of souls in the night. Still, what will it mean for us to incorporate this ancient way of imagining and inhabiting the night at a moment when the loss of night has become such a prominent part of our own experience? We cannot turn back the clock, nor will it do us any good to succumb to feelings of nostalgia for a time before a 24/7 consumer economy and pervasive light pollution came to dominate our experience of the world. Still, I think we are being invited in this historical moment to ask not only about what is being lost ecologically through our growing incapacity to make room for darkness, but also about the loss of night as a cultural, social, spiritual value, and how we should understand the meaning of our lives within a world increasingly devoid of darkness. Do we even value the night anymore? And if so, how should we express that value? One way of inviting the night back into our lives and our consciousness, and perhaps helping to restore it to a place of greater importance in the world, is to consider how it has functioned in our spiritual traditions. This is what I've tried to do this evening. Reflecting on the experience of early Christian monks offers us a valuable, if also complex and ambiguous, sense of what it meant for them to inhabit the night. Here, darkness is more than a metaphor of experience, although it is certainly that. It is also a crucial part of the space within which the monks moved continuously, in the rhythms of communal prayer, in solitary struggles in the cell, in journeys out across the vast desert, and in their interactions with one another and with their neighbors in the nearby towns and villages. So much of their lives unfolded in the hidden recesses of the night. Nor was their experience of the night simple, unambiguous, or consistent. It seems clear that many early monks found it challenging, even terrifying, to move through the night alone or in the company of others, and that facing themselves in solitude in the depths of the night could be harrowing. Still, there's also evidence to suggest that night in the desert could bring an unexpected sense of solace, especially in the tender exchanges between monks who found themselves drawn together in the depths of darkness, and who came to experience in those inscrutable spaces a dawning awareness of who they were in God. When they were able to affirm, as one saying puts it, that the hesychia of the night is enough for us if our thoughts are wakeful toward God. Yes, it is worthwhile, I think, to reflect on such precious moments and to consider again what it might mean for us to find ourselves at home in the silent, dark stillness of our own existence. And as a brief coda, and then I'm finished, I want to share with you a little portion of a poem that I think captures something of our own feeling of this in this moment. Louise Gluck's Midnight, from her wonderful book, Faithful and Virtuous Night. She says, "At last the night surrounded me. I floated on it, perhaps in it, or it carried me as a river carries a boat, and at the same time it swirled above me, star-studded, but dark nevertheless. These were the moments I lived for. I felt, mysteriously lifted above the world, so that action was at last impossible, which made thought not only possible, but limitless. It had no end. I did not, I felt, need to do anything. Everything would be done for me, or done to me. And if it was not done, it was not essential. Thank you so much.
So, on behalf of the Pappas Patristic Institute, which co-sponsors the event at the Huffington Ecumenical Institute, I'd like to thank Dr. Christie for this wonderful talk, which I'm very glad we did not schedule for midnight, noon, the evening. So we're all going to have a lot to think about as we exit into the night, in spite of the light pollution. We have time for questions. Just raise your hand, and Dr. Christie will be happy to converse with us.
Or responses of any kind, yes.
Or responses of any kind.
Always good to hear, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting us to take on the night in so many different modalities. But I want to bring up a female way that I'm just now appreciating, which is that when you get up in the middle of the night to nurse a newborn, I'm talking like, not just 6 weeks, but maybe years, and you just respond to someone else's need, and then you have to stay awake. You have to stay awake, hopefully, right? Which could take a long time, going in and out of a rhythm of being in communion with a little being. And you're all by yourself, generally. And everything gets very, very quiet. And I think that every woman I know, and have ever spoken with about this, you just go right into the depth of communion with the holy. And it's such an extraordinary journey. So I think that women all over the whole world are already in the night up in the desert with these little ones, right? And that are, living off your body. And you realize that you want to be there for them, but it's their life that, you've got to be there for them. So I don't know, maybe I'll write a book about, what it's like to be a nursing mother in the middle. Or you're in the night with a sick child who's awake all night long, off and on, and you simply give everything that you have, but you receive so much in that tender quietness where you just, you're rocking and rocking, like, I sleep yet? Okay, keep rocking, So I think that this is all about men, and it's wonderful, so I thank you for that. And I think we could expand our understanding and appreciation of women, not only as monastics, but as each of us has a built-in monasticism, an opportunity for that. We're just given that as a gift. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. You just expanded our reflections. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just a comment on this. Several things that come to my mind all throughout this, but I was struck by two things just looking at my own life. One, I was raised in a rural community, and I was blessed to have horses, and I grew up in the desert, and the rural community in the desert, and so I would, from time to time, take my horse out late at night, and just powerful spiritual moments, and also fear and anticipation, but also just kind of this idea of being on a journey with my horse at the time. It was very impactful. The second thing kind of peripherally relates to you. My wife and I just had our first daughter, and those late nights where she would just keep crying, and sleep deprivation and frustration and sometimes anger, and but I have to be present for my baby. I can't get frustrated, and trying to center myself.
You can't get frustrated? Is
Well,
that what you said?
I can't get frustrated in the sense that I don't want my my child to pick up on that or to feel that energy, if you will. And so I would kept trying to center myself back on turning that moment into prayer as much as I could. So anyway, those are just things came to my mind, and just why do you mention that?
So just a response to these two wonderful comments. I appreciate that. And, I wonder whether part of what we're being invited into as a theologically creative exercise is to say, well, I think what you're describing sounds very close to what the monks meant by hesychia. You're giving a new meaning to it and bringing it into the domestic space where it absolutely belongs. The literature doesn't give us very much access to that, and that we have to sort of recognize and maybe recognize its limitations, but you're giving it new meaning and depth, I think. You're describing, in some ways, I think, a practice of ascesis that is a catching of yourself, a kind of descent into a place of humility and openness to the moment in a way that, comes only in such situations of profound need. So again, it's a widening of our horizons about what these ideas can mean to us. Yes.
Yeah, from the sublime to the ridiculous. But your story made me remember, after all these years, when I was a crazy graduate student at UC Berkeley, and long before I was Orthodox, but there was one night when I was looking for a place where I would be able not to hear traffic and not to see the lights. And I kind of crept on under a bush on the Berkeley campus. It's something you could never do now because somebody would stop you and question you. But this was a long time ago. Anyway, you made me remember that.
And if we're allowed to have a little fun with this as we go on, here we have yet another kind of re-inhabiting of an old idea, anachoresis. You just practiced this little withdrawal under your bush in the way that and it's so interesting to hear your felt sense. You needed that so much, that withdrawal into some quieter space. Wonderful.
And also tautology, right? Berkeley and crazy.
Doug, I think that the night
For a lot of the early fathers in the desert was a real challenge. It was a daily challenge that they had to get through. But what I was thinking as I listened to you was, and you're the guy to answer this question, I think, is the night also apophatic? That is it a stripping away of images? Could you answer, or try to answer that?
A dear and old friend, Michael O'Loughlin, Dr. Michael O'Loughlin, he's too humble to say, he knows a thing or two about Evagrius. So to get a question like this is, I appreciate the depth from which it comes. I think in some ways, apophatic thought, as we have come to know it in both the Eastern and Western traditions, was developed kind of not primarily in the desert, but with figures like Gregory of Nyssa and Pseudo-Dionysius and others. And I can't give you an answer that has any kind of ring of authority, but if we think about your beloved Evagrius, for example, and his profound commitment to imageless prayer, I wonder if we're invited to think about that a little bit in terms of how long they spent out there in the depth of that darkness. Not only the darkness, but the desert. It feels reductive to say, oh, that's why he came to that teaching. I don't think it is, but I'm not sure we should ignore that either, that element of their lives. And I know for too long I read this literature without thinking sufficiently about the context in which it was born, and the geographical context, the way seasons unfolded there, how precarious one could feel moving in the night. These are all elements of life that were real for them. Did this lead them to strip away language, concepts, images? I'm not sure we can know for sure, but I think it's a really interesting question to consider, the relationship between them. You might have something to say about it. I think there was a little sense of something in your question that you might have an idea of yourself. Here.
Oh, I wish I could say something clever right now. Wouldn't that be great? Well, I think that the idea of going out into a desert place is to face a challenge for Anthony and his followers. It is to go to a place where you're not comfortable. It is to leave behind the structure of your life and to walk into devil land. And I think that the night was one more challenge. I think that, well, I do know something about Evagrius, and he seems to have spent a lot of his time counseling monks about how to fight off the various temptations and the various logismoi that came to them. And so I think that the darkness was another desert. It was another. They were throwing up a challenge. They were saying, I can be in this extreme, and God will care for me. God will take me through to the dawn.
Not so much clever, but beautiful. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You know, one of the most attractive things to me about this literature is this idea of paradox. And I find it everywhere when I read. It's just amazing to me. And I want to thank you because I've never thought of the night and what happens at night as yet kind of another part of this idea of paradox, that there are so many of these things going on that in some ways are competing with one another, and this desire to want to overcome, the night, but at the same time having to succumb to it, these kinds of. So I just want to thank you because I never really thought about that before. So thank you.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. One of the other things you lose with the light pollution are the markers of night, which they were so aware of. And maybe you could say a little bit of that. They could be attentive, say, to the cockcrow as marking one moment of when it's still dark. And there are darker nights. They have these sort of technical terms for those. And do those do those cash out in any spiritual differences, or is it all just a monolithic night? Or one of the things that we don't have a sensitivity to are these distinctions.
The markers of the night, by which you mean?
Sort of rising of a star,
yes.
could be, of the morning
Yes.
star, and then along
Yes.
with that is often the crowing of the cocks. Or
Mm-hmm.
the deepest night is sort of the hinge, the center point. And so if you gather collectively for vigils, it's at that certain point.
So I think a kind of a deeper dive than I've been able to make so far would be necessary to give a good response to that, meaning the longer I worked on this, the more I was aware of the filters that were operating all the time. That is to say, here's another story of someone moving around in the night. Oh, it's actually a story about something else, a spiritual teaching, and that's great, actually, but the night itself doesn't really get a chance to become, as it were, a subject of the story. And we shouldn't expect probably to see that in this literature, a kind of scientific curiosity about the night. On the other hand, you do notice, well, there were things like security concerns. It was dangerous to be out at night. And you have other stories where Cashin is very good at this. I mean, again, there's a little something hyperbolic here, but the rising of the sun, after sitting around having an all-nighter, not as college students would think of it, but as the monks did, which was just going, so deep into these questions. Oh, and then the sun began to rise, and there's a marker of we've been at this all night, but the night itself as a focal point of their interest, it doesn't show up very much, and we have to kind of guess at that a little bit.
Even the biblical warrants for speaking of the first or the second watch of the night is part of this, in something they, if they ever reflect on it or it ever informs their sensitivity to the night.
I think people who've studied the emergence of early liturgical practice have noted the relationship between those things, but it was often very unstructured in the early tradition. And so what we have come to think of the liturgy of the hours and other things that emerged, you see it in little faint emerging forms, but not very well developed. And it's a great question, though. I appreciate it. And I'll have to think about that more.
I had more of an ecologically minded question. I was curious if you would say that the desert sort of provides a point of meditation on the miracle of life, and that whatever does live in the desert, it's extremely precarious environment. So it's it relies on scarce rain, things like that, or even the desert itself. It's amorphous, it's shifting sand. I was curious if you've thought about that to an extent, and how maybe it kind of informs us about creation as a whole in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask your name? Ben. Ben, have you spent any time in the desert, Ben?
I actually have not. I enjoy the wilderness, but I've never been to the desert before.
No, I asked because, well, this is true of a lot of things, and so we could do a little free association here. Desert. And then we would say what comes to mind, and often it's arid, empty, desolate, and those things are often part of what a desert is. What we almost never say, at least in our first response, is intricate, ecologically complex, beautiful, delicate. These are, if you move around in a desert habitat with any kind of sensitivity to the biology of the place. I at a certain point apprenticed myself to some biologists who took me out into the Eastern Mojave, and through their eyes I began to notice what I couldn't see myself, which was this incredible symbiotic relationship of plants. And yes, the rainfall, we here in New England, you would hardly even think that it was worth speaking about. It's just the right amount for this habitat. I mean, it varies, and we're seeing changes with climate change, but so then you begin to think, this is, back to your other question. I mean, I don't like to throw around the word miraculous carelessly, but this world is miraculous, that there could be such a habitat that could not only survive, but thrive with very little rain, and that as we enter into it, hopefully with care, gives us the possibility to experience something that we can hardly ever get to in the crowded confines of our lives. The fact that such places exist and that we haven't destroyed them gives us a window into an element of the world for which we should be so grateful. And I encourage you, and if you write to me and tell me that you're ready to go to the desert, I'll take you. You should go to the desert.
I was just thinking that, so in the first verses of Genesis, right, it says that darkness was over the face of the deep. And it occurred to me that that's what these monks are doing, as he described it. They're entering into that deep, entering into that darkness. And that was the abode of demons. So they're entering into that very condition and struggling with it. And then, of course, what happens in the next verse? So it's silent, right? In Genesis, it comes out of silence. There's no sound. And then in the third verse it says, and God said, and there was light. So out of that silence comes light. And there's something else I wanted to mention. So the scripture, all the allusions to this condition, the Hebrew word is tohu. You're probably familiar with that, which is often translated as desert or emptiness. But the biblical sense is not the kind of sense that you've been looking at, right? You've been looking at the life of the desert and how these monks lived in it. But for Scripture, that tohu is utter emptiness, worse, more empty than the deep with its demons. It's utter emptiness, and to my mind, it's the absence of God. That's not where the monks were. So anyway, those thoughts were rolling around in my head.
I appreciate that. Who would have thought that a little simple reflection on the night could provoke such... It's really interesting, very interesting. Yes, thank you.
So we'll have two last questions, Father John and Father Michael.
I'm glad that Evagrius came into the conversation, because I think that this is how I see the desert. It's that breaking down of false presumptions that we might have, or false hierarchies that we've established for some reason, and I don't know where and when this all happened. We can guess at them, but who is it that taught us that a monk on Mount Athos in a particular monastery with a huge prayer rope with 300 beads, aspiring to see the divine light, maybe even seeing the divine light, is doing something more sacred than a mother getting up at night to nurse a child? I don't know where we got to make those sort of hierarchies in the spiritual life, or that a service in, a chapel like Vespers tonight, which was so beautiful, is somehow more inspiring than the memorial service outside the chapel with the leaves blowing just afterwards. So these are the sort of things that we need, I think, to question from time to time. That whole notion that I said earlier about moving on. It's good that you teach people about theosis, but their concept of theosis should be growing, and if it isn't, then we've lost something in the process.
I'd like to just respond to that. Yeah, I thought it was fascinating that your talk, you sort of drop hesychia right there at the beginning of the description, and as somebody who studied 14th century hesychasm, I'm sort of leaning a certain way, and then your talk really subverts that, because you expect a simplistic paradigm in which night and darkness are a kind of stillness and a stilling of human faculties and human imagination, etc. But what you get is something scary, a locus, as you said, of spiritual struggle. And the more you think about it, the more that makes sense. Night, darkness, biblically, spiritually, is equated with evil, it's equated with temptation, etc. So I very much appreciate this point. I think it is part of this broader understanding of even historical theology. But we'll end with Father Michael.
Thank you so much. I was very much struck by the contrast to my expectation about desert and night as inclined towards solitude. And you brought out so effectively just how much community is formed in many of these cases and many of the stories that you brought up. Community is formed through this experience of the night being shared and a shared struggle through the night and companionship within this. So many of our comments have touched on this as well. So I was wondering do you find that is explicitly reflected on at all? Part of what's provoking this is my thought about Theodoret's critique of the philosophers, that they say that they intend to really go and encounter God, but they don't withdraw from the world enough. And it's these Christian monks who actually withdraw, who form the real politeia, who form the real community in their withdrawal. So I was just wondering, is there any sense of the night itself being sort of formative for politeia, for authentic monastic politeia community in that sense?
That's a wonderful question. Working on this was all discovery for me. I didn't know what was in there when I started, seeing what people had to say about the night. And I confess that I was surprised and moved to encounter these stories of monks who were close to breaking down completely in the night and being held by another monk, held in the sense of just, I'm not going to leave you. And we like, and the desert itself often likes stories of conversion where something changes and there's an emergence into some new reality of who you are. And yet we also begin to notice around the edges that there are these places of intense ambiguity and uncertainty and unknowing that they were able to face with some degree of honesty. To me, that resonates so powerfully with something I think many of us struggle with in our own lives. And so if the emblem of somebody holding another human being in the night, you gave us a beautiful image at the beginning, but as we get older and we encounter suffering in our own lives and in the lives of others, we're not always meeting each other in the night, but sometimes we are, or we're meeting each other in this intense emptying out of meaning. I find that very compelling. And and there's always this, I really appreciate what you said, Father John. So the continued growth and expansion, it may be true for many readers as literature. You're like somebody standing on a pillar. Oh my gosh, somebody stood in a cave for 3 years and hardly slept. And it's a little kind of arresting of the imagination. And then little by little you see, that monk saw the brother had fallen asleep and put his head on his lap. And that story starts to kind of grow in significance. And the ascetic rigor is there. It's part of the story, but it's not the center of the story at all. So community that connects to and is nourished by solitude, I think, is one of the great teachings of the desert. That solitude and community are always bound together, and we need that so much still, I think. So the night is part of it, but the night is just one element in a larger story. Yes. Yeah. Thank you all for coming out. On this night. Thank you for the invitation.